Thanks very much. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the how PeopleSoft authenticates users and the various features that we provide to help integrate with other authentication systems. As always, any future features that I talk about are governed by the Oracle Safe Harbor statement. So just to get some background definitions in terms of the things that we're going to be talking about. Authentication gives users the right to access the system. Authorization gives users the rights to access data and pages within the system. So there's two very different things there. The other thing we're talking about is single sign-on. Single sign-on is often used as sort of an overall general sort of term when really what's intended is access management. For instance, Oracle Access Manager doesn't only provide single sign-on, it also provides what I call policy managed access. So I can set up fine-grained access through Policy Manager for users signing on. We also have another phrase, common or same sign-on. This is the sort of sign-on that you would think of when you think about LDAP authentication with PeopleSoft. So with LDAP authentication with PeopleSoft, you still have to enter your username and password. Even if you have multiple separate PeopleSoft applications all authenticating against LDAP, you would have to enter the same username and password. So this is generally called common or same sign-on. And then federated identity. So federated identity, separately from access management, is generally thought of as multiple domain single sign-on. Access management, the common vendor products around access management use a token or a cookie to provide or propagate the identity across the products. And cookies can't be shared across multiple domains. That's where federated identity comes in. Now, the reason that federated identity, which has been around for a long time, but it's become into prominence over the last 2 or 3 years, largely because of cloud or off-premise environments. So customers are sharing their resources across both on-premise equipment and in some sort of hosted environment, usually called cloud, software as a service, or hosted environment. So the customers have a multiplicity of deployments. And there's a need to provide users at least with a common experience across all those environments. Also in the last, 4 or 5 years, maybe more, a product called Shibboleth, or a federated approach called Shibboleth, primarily used in the higher ed environment, and that's a set of open source libraries that the higher ed institutions can make use of. But looking at Shibboleth gives a very good understanding of the needs and the requirements and restrictions in terms of a federated environment, especially where you're using the SAML token, which has become the sort of the standard for federated identity. So a couple of the things we look at is PeopleSoft as an identity provider, PeopleSoft as a service provider, federated identity, and the PeopleSoft features to support identity management customization. In all identity management systems, because once we install some sort of external authentication feature for PeopleSoft, the one fundamental requirement is trust. So PeopleSoft effectively will trust the external authentication solution or servers features. So you've effectively devolved PeopleSoft's authentication, management of that authentication out of PeopleSoft. So it's a significant thing to be aware of, because there's always a risk when you externalize authentication. Now, if you look at the things that PeopleSoft can do as an identity provider, we're all very familiar with the PS token, at least the term PS token, and what that can do. And PeopleSoft's internal authentication mechanism is called a PS Authenticator. PeopleSoft also delivers support for certificate-based authentication. This is where there's an SSL or a certificate on the server, and the users are provided with specific user certificates rather than the root certificate that most users have as part of their browser experience. A lot of the browsers already come with standard root certificates, which means that the browser will trust the server, but the server doesn't have any reason to trust the user at that point, unless the user also has a user certificate. If the user is provided with a user certificate, we'll see that PeopleSoft can use that as a sort of a seamless single sign-on. PeopleSoft also has native single sign-on based on the top level or the authentication node. This has been in place for a long time. And the PeopleSoft as an identity provider has a number of features. One is there's a component interface delivered which can be used by external products outside of PeopleSoft. In other words, non-PeopleSoft solutions called PRTL_SS_CI. This will allow that external program or feature or a solution to consume the PS token and then send the PS token back into PeopleSoft and get the user ID based off that PS token. And then we introduced the security authorization service. This allows external programs to access PeopleSoft security to see once that program has a PeopleSoft user ID, it can make a web service call to see what security that user has within PeopleSoft and use that then as a way of authorizing that user's access in the external program. So we're all pretty familiar with the PS token is issued on successful native login by PeopleSoft. The PS token sits in the browser. This PS token is not written to disk; it's maintained in memory in the browser. So it's I'll say it's intended to be secure in that fashion, but obviously depends on a lot of other layers of security that that have been implemented. The PS token is based off the user's identity in the PS Opera Defin, which is the PeopleSoft's user repository store. With certificate-based authentication, the user either has the user certificate installed on their workstation or other accessing device. That's often implemented as a smart card. So plug-in smart card. So the user has a USB-based card reader, and that smart card is just plugged into that reader while the user is online. The user then at that stage, based off PeopleSoft support for SSL authentication, the browser support that's delivered with the smart card reader then will forward effectively the DN from the smart card into PeopleSoft, which reads it and then uses that to extract the user ID from an LDAP server and provide the user access. So it's still from a PeopleSoft perspective, the user authenticating against PeopleSoft. The PeopleSoft doesn't see this as any form of single sign-on type solution, although effectively it is. But it's each access attempt is essentially atomic, and it doesn't spread out across applications. With PeopleSoft single sign-on, this is delivered PeopleSoft single sign-on, which a lot of customers use when they're in their PeopleSoft environments. There's a top-level trusted node, and once the PS token has been issued for one browser session, that browser session then automatically has access to any of the PeopleSoft applications that are part of that same trust. So the value of the portal single sign-on component interface is to allow other users to effectively trust PeopleSoft's authentication. So PeopleSoft authentication is still the native authentication, but what we're doing with this feature then is to allow non-PeopleSoft systems to access or trust the user based on PeopleSoft's already authenticated user. the mechanism in this case is that the external non-PeopleSoft system, which has to be on the same domain, and consequently gets presented with the PS token as part of the access sort of package in the browser headers, consumes the PS token and issues the PS token with the component interface back to PeopleSoft. PeopleSoft responds with either an OK or not OK, whether the user's already signed in and validated, and then that component interface can request the user ID that's associated with the PS token. So the non-PeopleSoft system is not breaking down or unbundling the PS token. It still sees PS token as a PS token as a single package. It just delivers that back to PeopleSoft, and then PeopleSoft responds with the user ID associated with it. So in this case, the non-PeopleSoft system would either have to have the same user IDs as part of its repository or some form of alias within its application, so that it would associate the PeopleSoft user ID with the user ID associated with that non-PeopleSoft system. So the security authorization service, we introduced it as really to support a number of things internally, but then saw it as being very useful and made it available as a web service. So in this case, the non-PeopleSoft system, say reporting or data warehouse, can issue a request to PeopleSoft to see what rights or authorization a user has in the PeopleSoft system, and then use that as a way of delivering similarly restricted or secured access back to that user from that non-PeopleSoft system, say, as I said, like an external data warehouse. So now we're going to talk about a couple of things. The LDAP integration, the concept of the intercept, which is important when we look at external either single sign-on systems or access management systems, because it's the intercept where that access management token is created. The access management token is going to be separate from the PeopleSoft's PS token. A couple of releases ago, we introduced the Kerberos SDK, and this was designed more for education and to help customers look at what's involved in Kerberos. We delivered it as an SDK, which is a software development kit, and the intent was for customers to use it to develop their own approach to Kerberos authentication. It caused a great deal of confusion in the marketplace. So a lot of customers thought that the authentication, the Kerberos authentication delivered in this SDK was delivered code, and consequently there were if they had issues, then it caused some churn afterwards. But it largely uses a servlet filter. We've taken it out of PeopleSoft documentation, but it's available from my Oracle support. We still delivered the SDK as part of the PeopleSoft delivery. And then the last thing, we're going to talk about sign-on people code. Sign-on people code is pretty robust. It's been around for a while. All of the access management vendors use sign-on people code to integrate their product with PeopleSoft. So SiteBinder, Tivoli, BMC had some products as well to do access management. Oracle's Access Manager, PeopleTools actually delivers the code to integrate Oracle Access Manager with PeopleSoft. So it's a configuration implementation rather than a customization implementation. And then we'll talk about, as I've mentioned, some of the other access management systems that use sign-on people code as well. So when we're looking at LDAP integration, we deliver with PeopleTools out-of-the-box LDAP authentication. And for that, there are a number of configuration pages that have to be set up. In the LDAP authentication, there are three primary LDAP calls. There's obviously the connect, so the application server connects to the LDAP server. There's a search call based on the ID that the user has entered. This obviously doesn't have to be their, and shouldn't be their PeopleSoft user ID. So typically it's an enterprise ID, like their email address, their enterprise email address, or some other enterprise ID that they're using. So it's a common ID that they use to access all of their applications. The sign-on people code that supports LDAP authentication then does a bind. So this is an absolute connect to the user object in the LDAP server using the returned DN from the search and the password that the user has entered to do which effectively validates their access to the user object in the LDAP server. And then the last thing that PeopleSoft calls is a PeopleSoft function called set authentication result. And this is the piece that checks to make sure that the user ID that's been returned from the user object in the LDAP server is a user ID that exists in PS upper defin, and then it issues the effectively validates the user at that point and issues PS token to the user and starts the session. So in terms of LDAP integration setup, I certainly always recommend that to validate the connectivity between the application server, which is what does the connect to the LDAP server, that as part of the setup that you run the LDAP command line utilities from that server. So things like LDAP search from the command line in the on the application server. That does two things. First of all, it establishes the connectivity between the application server, but in framing those command lines, you also make sure that you have the both the attributes and the connect phrases that's going to be needed when you do the configuration of the directory setup. So then you do this, use the PeopleSoft delivered pages to configure the directory, do the schema management. The PeopleSoft PIA pages allow you to additionally test the connectivity between PeopleSoft and the LDAP server. You can create authentication maps and create additional user profile maps. One of the features that PeopleSoft LDAP integration delivers is the ability to create a default account for the user if they're not already configured in PeopleSoft. So this is done primarily to roll out self-service. You've got 60,000 users that you want to provide self-service to. You don't want to have to go in and actually create all of those users. You can use the fact that they're already set up, say, in your Active Directory to create that default account, like a default self-service account for that user. So the user, the first time they log in, they see a slight delay where PeopleSoft is connecting to the LDAP server, validating that their user account exists in LDAP, and then creating the default account for them in PeopleSoft, like the self-service account, so they get straight into self-service at that point. So the first time that they authenticate against PeopleSoft, there's probably about an extra sort of 4 or 5 seconds between the time that they log in and the time that they get their first page from PeopleSoft. Now, one of the questions that came up was, how do I get application designer users to authenticate against LDAP? Sign-on people code is triggered in the 3-tier access between application designer and the access to PeopleSoft. But there's also a feature that I haven't heard too many users talking about in terms of, especially if they're using the Oracle DB. Oracle DB will actually authenticate against LDAP. So if you have users logging in 2-tier mode with Application Designer, then you should be able to set up the application, the database, to authenticate against the same LDAP that the PeopleSoft is authenticating against, and effectively then give your Application Designer users LDAP authentication with the PeopleSoft application, or the Application Designer users LDAP authentication with PeopleSoft. So this is a very busy slide. One I created a long time ago when I was explaining how single sign-on works in a PeopleSoft context. And virtually all of the access management providers, including Oracle Access Management Manager and the like the Tivoli and BMC and SiteMinder, use the same effective mechanisms. But you can see here from the time that the browser user first attempts to access the system, there's quite a lot going on in the background before the user actually gets to see the first screen. And we'll come across this idea of the intercept. The intercept sits on is an agent that sits on the HTTP web server. Typically, what it does is it intercepts the browser request, checks to see if the single sign-on or the access management solution providers, if their proprietary token is actually in the browser header. If it's not in the browser header, then it issues the challenge. But it's a challenge from the Access Manager system and not the challenge from PeopleSoft. Now, that sign-on or challenge page can look very similar to or can be designed to look very similar to a PeopleSoft credential challenge page. So it's looking for the user ID and password. If these access management systems have additional security features like the RSA or multi-factor type of sign-on, where it's looking for an additional set of credentials, like the data that's on the fob, like the RSA fob, or some other access external multi-factor authentication attribute. We have a lot of customers using like an SMS or a one-time password feature as well. So all of those can be part of that Access Manager challenge screen. Once the user validates their credentials with the access management system, the access management system then does a redirect into PeopleSoft, having extracted the PeopleSoft user ID associated with the Access Manager user ID. And then the PeopleSoft authenticates the user based on that. But again, as I say, what it's doing in this case is PeopleSoft is trusting the fact that the access management system has already validated the user, because at this point, the only thing that gets passed into PeopleSoft is the user ID. And that user ID is checked against PSOPRDEFN to see if that user is a valid user in PeopleSoft. So PeopleSoft at that stage is not doing any other validation of that user other than the fact that that user ID exists in PSOPRDEFN. All of the trust has been devolved out to the access management system. This is an overview of the Kerberos authentication and the ticket that gets created. It's worthwhile having a look at that to get an understanding of how that mechanism works. The other feature or the other aspect of this delivery is that because we deliver it as an SSO filter, this filter sits outside of the PeopleSoft delivered servlets, so it can be used for a lot of other things as well. But I typically advise customers, if they're externalizing their authentication, then they need to be very diligent about how to do that. I'm not a big fan of custom authentication methods in an organization, especially where that organization has a duty of care both for the users, the customers, and the data it has responsibility for. From the point of view of our delivered access management, this becomes, as I said, it's a configuration feature, so it's added into the. We delivered these function calls as part of PeopleTools. With each release of PeopleTools, we test PeopleSoft against Access Manager to make sure that that integration is still robust. Between Access Management 10G and Access Management 11G, Oracle changed the attribute that it used to store the PeopleSoft user ID that was passed into PeopleSoft. So there was some change in the sign-on people code at that stage. For customers who have mixtures of PeopleTools and Access Management systems, so I'd say a lot of customers who are still on Oracle 10G Access Manager, but upgrade to People Tools, say 852 or 853, 854. We're assuming in the delivered people code that it's using the remote OEM remote user to deliver the PeopleSoft user ID. The attribute in Access Manager 10G was PS_SSUID. So there's the possibility that a slight change is needed in the sign-on people code if you're implementing PeopleSoft with a newer version of People Tools, but still using the older version of Access Manager, of Oracle Access Manager. So moving into one of the hotter topics. A lot of people confuse SAML with federated identity, assuming that support for SAML is support for federated identity, which is not necessarily the case. SAML describes both a token, which PeopleSoft does use for authenticating web services, and a protocol, which has to be managed by a federated identity provider. PeopleSoft doesn't support that natively. However, we have tested internally and we validate the use of Oracle Identity Federation, the OIF product. The OIF product sits outside of Oracle Access Manager with a connector for Oracle Access Manager and for other access management systems. There are a number of other identity providers that have some level of integration with PeopleSoft, either because they have an existing connection or integration with Oracle Access Manager, or because they provide some other plugin for the PeopleSoft product, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So typically in a federated identity environment, there's a need for the identity provider. So that adds a layer of communication to the connect request. The way that the identity provider, or the federation identity provider, manages the cross-domain identity, as I said, the typically access management systems use a cookie or a token, which can only be single domain. When you're looking at the multi-domain federated identity requirements, then that token or that identity request has to be managed across the domain, and the only way that can be done is by a post request. And the identity provider essentially and the integration feature on the product like PeopleSoft effectively does a redirect with a post request out to the identity provider, which returns the validated user response. And then the protocol or the traffic flow is pretty much similar to the flow that I showed in the access management request on that very busy screen. So typically in a federated environment, there's a single identity provider, and then whether these other organizations have either, say in the case of Oracle products, if this identity provider is OIF, then the Access Manager, Oracle Access Manager, would have those the capability of connecting to that identity provider. Most identity providers, or most federated identity solutions, have multiple connectors because you recognize that customers have different forms of access management systems. Now, one of the concerns with a centralized identity provider is that all of the user identities have to be effectively submitted to that identity provider, and that can either be done as bulk load or ad hoc. And how that happens is based on how the identity provider, the federated identity solution provider, has actually enabled that to be facilitated. But it's certainly a concern that when you're introducing federated systems, is how does that identity, a centralized identity provider, know about all the users on your system? And that's done typically by an export of metadata from the access management system to the federated identity system. So from a federated identity perspective, there are two types of authentication, and I look at the first one, which is common or same sign. This is where, when you're accessing, say, the on-premise application and the hosted or cloud or off-premise solution, that you use the same user ID and password. So you're using the same sign-on. You don't automatically have single sign-on between your sessions. And this has been implemented in a number of different ways. I spoke about the non-Oracle products having a plugin. So under Sun's OpenSSO, they deliver a thing called a Fedlet. Ping also have the concept of Fedlet. RSA have the concept of Fedlet, and this is a library that can be plugged into the application. Say in this case, say PeopleSoft, and when PeopleSoft intercepts that user ID and password coming from the browser user, instead of going against the native authentication in PeopleSoft, it makes a call out to the identity provider with those federated identity credentials. So again, this would typically be, say, the email address and a password that's going to be validated by the external system. The Fedlet makes it a direct call. So this is sort of a service provider initiated federation, where PeopleSoft as a service provider is actually making the call out to the federated identity provider system. And the identity provider system obviously has to have a repository of all of the PeopleSoft users. And it generally further breaks that down by almost a credential-based or making sure that user has proper access to the system, that they're not only that they're authenticated against the system, but can also restrict the user's access by making sure that user has access to this as a set of resources that user has proper access to. Shibboleth, which is a feature, a federation feature that a lot of the colleges have taken up, operates pretty much in the same way. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So Shibboleth is it's an open source support for federation. If you're interested in looking both at just the generality of federation and in Shibboleth in particular, I would suggest that you subscribe to shibboleth.net, which has a number of listservs, especially the users.shibboleth.net. That's a very active listserv, and it gives great insight not only into the concerns about implementing Shibboleth, but also just general concerns about implementing federated identity and the difficulties in doing that. One of the issues that we've come across in looking at the industry in general is not so much single sign-on across a federated environment, but single sign-off, and how that federated solution, and Shibboleth in particular, manages sign-off. So how it destroys both the federated tokens and the user session tokens on the application, or even across multiple applications. In a lot of cases, it's possible to leave the cookies or tokens that provide access to the underlying applications sitting in a browser. If they're not destroyed properly, and the session is not destroyed, then it's possible to get unintended access into the application. So in support for Shibboleth, the historically they had a where are you from, because the shibboleth was establishing the trust between the user and the multiple sets of resources that it had access to. This symbol looks like a keyhole, but it's intended to be the user accessing the workstation. More recently, Shibboleth has what's called a discovery service, so it can go out and make sure that that user has proper access to the resource that the user is attempting to access. Again, very useful to go out to. In Common is one of the resources that the higher ed institutions have access to, and it has established a lot of standards around federated identity using Shibboleth. It's worthwhile having a look at the InCommon site, especially the discovery service from InCommon. In terms of supporting custom authentication mechanisms, PeopleSoft delivers a number of features. The sign-on people code, which most customers are reasonably familiar with. The idea of a default role, which I spoke about in terms of LDAP authentication, and then the dynamic role feature in PeopleSoft. The default role allows you as a customer to establish say, as I spoke about earlier, rolling out say self-service to many thousands of users without having to go in and go through the exercise of defining those users within PeopleSoft. So that self-service user can be rolled out based on the LDAP authentication. PeopleSoft trusts the LDAP. If the user authenticates against LDAP, then the default role can be automatically assigned to that user, so they get a reasonably seamless experience in signing on to PeopleSoft, even if they've never been in PeopleSoft before. The dynamic role rules extend that feature in a number of ways, primarily by doing an access request or a select from the back-end database in PeopleSoft. So the user's role within PeopleSoft can be changed based on their changing status within PeopleSoft. So somebody changes department, their role may change as a consequence of their change in department or their change in job type. PeopleSoft has the capability of accessing that back-end database to see what the current role and department is, and changing the role of the user based on those features. The other aspect of this is there's a feature called group membership in LDAP, and based on the group membership of that user, their role can be created or changed as that changes. So again, this is a way of reducing the effort involved in giving a user appropriate access into PeopleSoft, not just authentication. So not just saying that the user is a valid user, but giving them the appropriate access within PeopleSoft. From the point of view of enabling sign-on people code, if the user is not already authenticated, there are two bullet or radio buttons here. One is invoke as the user signing in, or invoke as a top level user, or as a user that can execute sign-on people code. So these are important distinctions. If we're invoking sign-on people code as a user signing in, then that user signing in has to be allocated the right or the privilege to execute sign-on people code. If we're invoking as a user who can only execute sign-on people code, which is typically the way then that most sign-on or access management code is validated or made available, is to have the sign-on people code be invoked as a user who should only have rights to run sign-on people code, not have any other rights within the system. So if this user's ID and the password in some way gets exposed, the only rights that user has within the system then is to execute sign-on people code. link is not working at the moment. So sign-on people code, as you can see here, sign-on people code is either in the record funklib underscore pwd control or funklib LDAP. Funklib LDAP is the record that maintains most of the sign-on people code. If you're not familiar with it, it's worthwhile having a look at that code. In the case of the LDAP authentication, you can see it executing the search request and the bind request, and then executing the set authentication result that I've already spoken about. Here's the page that we use to set up the default role. In this case, as you can see, we've enabled the use of a default role, and this would typically be a self-service role. To set up dynamic role rules, the role can be query based. As I said, the enabling feature in PeopleSoft can issue SQL against the backend database. So to see which department the user is in or what their job title is, and then based on that, set up the or change the user's role. Excuse me. Sorry. And we've a couple of different mechanisms for doing that. The query based is the SQL against the backend database. People code is we can have a fixed set of rules in people code to change that role, or we can base it off the group membership in the backend directory. The query and people code rules are generally executed by a batch job, which you run on as frequently as the roles need to change. The directory rule can actually happen dynamically. This is where the group membership in LDAP is used to define the role of that user within PeopleSoft. That can be enabled to run dynamically. So as the user signs in, their role is created within PeopleSoft. The Oracle Mobile and Social Access Management, that now supports IDAuth and OAuth. It's very useful to have a look at that documentation to see what features can be delivered. And the new version of Access Manager is actually bundled with Identity Federation. Previously, Identity Federation and Access Management were two separately licensed products. Within the new version of Access Management, Federation can be part of the same license. And again, as I said in times before, I use the Oracle products as a way of gaining an understanding into what should be required for an access management product, rather than being definitive or the only product that should be considered, but certainly using the features that are delivered here as a way of testing other products and what they deliver.